95th edition, 15th stage, May 2012. Extraordinary. The Giro has become what it is also because it knows how to be unique and new at each edition, while remaining constantly true to itself. You return to some roads, but certain days are not repeatable. Some runners have no equal. The climbs are repeated several times in the route. They are largely the same, yet they're not always the exact same. On the contrary. Since 1962, the Aprica has been tackled by hundreds of athletes. After 1962, it returned in 90, 91, but in 94, the Pirate transforms it into an unforgettable day, showing the world that a champion has come to the Giro. Cuneo Pinerolo would be fought by others, of course, but in 1949, it was Fausto Coppi's. It repeats without repeating. The Giro changes without changing. 106 editions that spanned over a century. The first go was given when the bicycle was still a means of transport for a select few until today. In between, generations of very different cyclists have raced. Those were men who've travelled roads that in the imagination of sports enthusiasts are intrinsically linked to the Corsa Rosa. It's difficult to think of Gavia and Stelvio without hearing in your ears the sound of the gears changing to face the climbs. And other times, they ventured into new places. The mountain has a simple rule. If you want to go further, you can't go around it. You have to get to the top. This is in Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs. Produced by Dogge in association with Agenzia ICE for an appreciation of the best that Made in Italy has to offer. Episode 6, Valico di Valcava, the unique stages that make the Giro what it is. Like Valcava, it's a pass at an altitude of 1,340 meters, between two not well-known but picturesque valleys, those of San Martino and Imagna. They are between the provinces of Lecco and Bergamo in the pre-Alpine Alps. 11.6 kilometers with a vertical drop of about 910 meters, with an average gradient of 7.8%. The most challenging point is that wall that rises for a few hundred meters, with a leg-breaking gradient of 18 degrees. In Valcava's past, there's not only cycling. In the first decades of the last century, it was the mountain of the Lombards who climbed up from the plain to practice winter sports. It was one of the oldest ski resorts in the region, immortalized in black and white shots that portray men and women from another era. Reachable by cable car since 1928, a ramp for ski jumping and a ski lift were added in 1936. It was another time when even at that height the snow could fall, if not abundantly, at least in sufficient quantities to whiten the slopes. In Valcava, you could ski until the 70s. Then the installation closed. Today, the memory of that ski resort has faded, and Valcava seems an unusual destination for snow enthusiasts. But even without skis, it remains a mountain. It became a sport destination once more. The World Rally was raced there in 2020, down the pass. That's right, downhill and not uphill, because its slopes are hostile even to those with 600 horsepower of engine to push them towards the top. Other sets of wheels faced Valcava from the bottom up. They were the cyclists, for whom the slope represented an important challenge. That name may sound unfamiliar among Giro loyalists, but the pass is nonetheless known for the crossing of the Giro di Lombardia from 1986 to 2011. Riders such as Laurent Fignon and Ivan Gotti have pedalled on that uphill section. It's a demanding stage, especially for cyclists who intend to face the entire racing season. In fact, it hasn't often appeared on the Lombard itinerary as of late. The Giro has also passed through there in the 2012 edition. That was the only time, because it had never been climbed before. It came back in 2023, and who knows if Valcava will be affected by the same fate of other discovered mountains made famous by the Corsa Rosa. For the moment, it remains one of those rare stages, almost an exception. But as we know, the Giro is also made up of these incredible exceptions. The most well-known of these travelled through Lombardy first in 1917, crossing the valleys of the Lecco area, and then again in 1924. With the prophetic surname Strada, first name Alfonsina, a woman. The woman who, with her number 72, faced the 3,613 kilometers of the 12th edition, the Corsa Rosa. A pioneer of sport and of female emancipation. She had discovered her passion for cycling at a very young age, and had already managed to run her first races as a girl, keeping it hidden from her parents. At the age of 16, she ran to Turin and then to Russia, where she arrived accompanying her colleague, Carlo Messori. Alfonsina Strada was independent, regardless of what society expected of girls, and was not satisfied with women's competitions. So, she asked to compete in the Giro di Lombardia as the only woman among the 43 cyclists in the race. Armando Cognet accepted her entry, also because the regulation didn't explicitly forbid it. Alfonsina Strada pedalled for those 200 kilometers between Milan, Varese, Como and Lecco. In 1924, with her husband hospitalized for mental health problems, she also entered the Giro, arousing curiosity, skepticism, and then great enthusiasm. The Diavolo in Gonella struggled to keep up with her male colleagues, but gave a great sporting demonstration, pedaling to the end despite the accumulated delay. She was also among the 30 cyclists who completed the race out of the 90 who started. She was loved, supported, and she represented the idea that a woman could run the whole country, just like male athletes. Armando Cognet let her do it, from Milan to Taranto, running through each stage, fighting and toiling through that long journey through Italy, which we know as the Giro. So, Valcava, a demanding stage of the Giro of Lombardy, which was the first great test of Alfonsina Strada. And this year, it's also a stage of the Corsa Rosa. A pass where one feels like gazing into the distance, towards the valley below, because nearby there's a forest of not exactly picturesque relays. That's right, from the antennas of Valcava to the panoramas of the Sicilian Etna, the Giro d'Italia is also a variety of environments that continues to surprise. From the beginning of its history, it was clear that the Giro had to cross the country, passing through the most famous, well-known and recognizable places, but not just there. The route winds through the peninsula, exploring it, taking the race through villages, the countryside, big cities, along the coast and through the mountains. On the sheet given to cyclists upon registration in that distant 1909 when it all began, it read, "All of Italy wants to see you, admire you." It's therefore necessary to race among the Italians, to tighten the bond with the country. The course was conceived with this spirit from the very first year. Approximately 2,500 kilometers to run in the second half of May, 127 cyclists who met in Piazzale Loreto, Milan, just before 3 in the morning. They started early as the road was long. They would reach as far as Naples and then return north towards Turin and then to Milan again. Only 49 completed all the stages up to the end. Bologna, Chieti, Naples, Rome, Florence, Genoa and Turin were the cities they passed through. In between, a good part of Italy. Not all of it, of course. It took time to really bring the cyclists to every part of the country, down to the lesser known places. Valcava is the exception, but Valcava is also the rule. It's in Lombardy, a region that has a special relationship with the Giro. Milan is the leader of the protagonist cities, boasting 56 departures of the Tour and 88 arrivals. Milan is the city where it all started. It was the summer of 1908 when an idea began to be discussed inside 2 buildings in that very city. Why not organize a stage race that would also visit the rest of this beautiful country, as our cousins from beyond the Alps had already been doing successfully for some years with their tour. At the same time, this was being discussed in the headquarters of 2 important newspapers, both Corriere della Sera and Gazzetta dello Sport, and both began to really work on it. When the Gazzetta discovered that there was someone else with the same intuition, they hastened to make the announcement. It was the director of the sports magazine, Eugenio Camillo Costamagna, who wrote it in black and white, actually, in black and pink, on August 24th. The National Cycling Tour would be held next spring, a race open to anyone who wanted to participate. The decision had been made. The Corriere made its contribution, offering the prize of 3,000 liras to the winner. Armando Cogne, administrative director of the Gazzetta at the time, gave a great contribution to the rest, since he had some experience in the field of cycling. The choice of the route had to take into account practical issues, which today are perhaps difficult to imagine. In 1909, more than a century ago, many roads were dirt roads, difficult to travel on 2 wheels. Let's also remember that the organization was still in its infancy, and the athletes ran alone, without support. In case of damage or punctures, you'd have to fix the bicycle as best you could, or you were forced to retire from the race. In the very first edition, some regions were excluded for this very reason, because they were judged inviable, as Cogne explained it with regret. The roads didn't turn out to be much better in general. In fact, the race was interspersed with several days of rest to recover from the fatigue. Most of the riders in that first race came from the north, mostly Lombard, and then people from Piedmont and Romagna. Edition after edition, the Giro has expanded its itinerary, extending to the entire country, following the intuition that had already guided Annene Torriani, the 2 men who held the reins of the event. The Corsa Rosa needed athletes, and the athletes needed roads to race on. Ideally, those would be streets crowded with fans ready to support the runners. Streets suitable for sprinters and even climbers, capable of challenging and putting on a show in front of people who would come to see the bikes go by. Roads that would enter the heart and remain in our memories, and also new roads never before travelled, and above all, Italian roads. And so, the Giro ended up leaving Lombardy and truly became the Giro of an entire country, of its protagonists and, for better or for worse, of its troubles. To tell us about Italy at the beginning of the 20th century, we still have those first itineraries, with those regions without roads suitable for bikes. And then there were 3 editions which were skipped due to the war. Between 1915 and 1918, the men left their bicycles to take up arms. Then there was a Giro which came back with peacetime and found itself in the midst of all the problems of the first post-war period to face. Those were the years in which they raced on tracks to satisfy the desire to compete even when organising road races was far too complicated. As we can see once again that the chosen stages have a particular value, representing their precise historical moment. May 1919. The resumption of the Giro after the First World War, the 7th edition. They raced from Trento to Trieste, passing through a part of Italy where there had been violent fighting, and where hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died, clashing against the Austro-Hungarian enemies, whose blood sacrifices had been just as tragic. That spring, the runners would cross the Isonzo River, bringing the sports competition right to where, until then, people had gone to die. These were symbolic stages, where the history of the Giro overlapped with that of the town. Then came the 1920s and the idea of national greatness and autarky. To sum it up, if it's done within the borders, it's better. Italians therefore had to race on Italian bikes, by law. The men who worked behind the Giro in Cugne's Milan office continued to believe that racing was a sporting matter and that it must keep its distance from any political stance. You try, yet you don't always succeed. 1936 was the year of the Rieti Terminillo, a stage which was included in the itinerary to give visibility to Mount Terminillo as requested by the Duce, while he spent his holidays in the mountain resort in the company of his lover, Claretta Petacci, in the beautiful Villa Chigi. These are roads that crossed history, as we said. Meanwhile, edition after edition, the Giro explored new parts of the map of Italy. Already from the 2nd edition, it went to Udine, Teramo and Mondovì, expanding on the map. A year later, it entered Bari. In 1920, it reached Trieste. In 1924, it went all the way down to Taranto. In 1929, the organisers faced enormous organisational difficulties, and the Giro truly arrived in the south. Foggia, Lecce, Potenza, Salerno. But the road is unpredictable in many ways. There have been editions marred by nails on the asphalt, and others affected by bad accidents. In the 2nd stage of 1929, a boy crossed the road at the wrong time and ended up being tragically run over. The strongest of all was the enthusiasm of the fans, of the enthusiasts, of the curious. Edition after edition, routes were studied, returning to some places and adding new ones. Nobody raced on Italian roads between 1941 and 1945. And it's interesting that the 1940 edition was won by Bartoli, and the 1946 edition by Coppi. Just before and just after the war, the 2 champions both put their mark on the Corsa Rosa. With the return of peacetime, once again they pedalled through the rubble, and once again the stages of the Giro intertwined with history. In 1950, the race ended up in Rome for the Holy Year, and Pope Pius XII welcomed the cyclist to St. Peter's, meeting Bartoli and Coblet. And it's said that the Italian was deeply hurt by the fact that he finished 2nd on that occasion. In the years of the economic boom, the choice of stages became even more complex, while the whole organisation behind the event increased its commitment. You could travel through Italy choosing the best roads, the most spectacular and interesting ones, talking to local administrations and possible sponsors. It was a hard job, just as demanding as those climbs that were generously included in the itinerary of some days. The effort paid off. Italy was growing and wanted to shake off the painful memory of the war years. It was more and more passionate about the race. The precise itineraries, the climbs, the slopes were starting to be published. Enthusiasts could then study the details of each stage. And in the meantime, the Giro became truly Italian, exploring the south, arriving in Sicily. But then it went further and also looked abroad, with the victory of Hugo Coblet, a Swiss, and crossing the national borders. Italians started learning foreign names: Gaul, Anquetil, Merckx. The geography of the Giro transformed. An unexpected ally also contributed to the popularity of cycling in Italy. It was a technological progress of the television, which brought the images of the runners into homes. While in the 1950s, not all Italians had a TV, in 1968 there were already more fans following Eddy Merckx's ascent of the Tre Cime di Lavaredo. Unstoppable. That was the most used word to talk about that day. For the first time, you could even see on the runners' faces what it was like to climb some mountains. Le Tre Cime was one with the painful but implacable expression of Merckx. It was also a sign of the rotation of heroes on two-wheelers. On that peak, Gimondi was in big trouble, like Motta, buried within the group. His race was an ordeal. And so the reporters said. The names of the places were associated with the men who made them unforgettable. There are many race stages linked to a name, to a particular feat, to the story of a particular man. Monte Bondone is Charlie Gaul in 1956, who arrives at the end despite the merciless frost. Saint-Denis di Piave Zoncolan, 2003, was represented by Gilberto Simoni, who set off on the run 2 kilometers from the finish line and won. The Zoncolan was a mountain that gave the runners nightmares, according to Simoni himself. Mortirolo now has its own cycling mythology. Miguel Indurain, a man who demonstrated his infinite endurance on the mountains, called it the hardest climb ever. Important names for important stages. It's true, the Giro is made up of athletes who made history and of mountains such as Monte Bondone, Aprica and Zoncolan, with its vertical ascent peak of 22%. But not just that. There are some days that bring the Giro to less famous places, up lesser known valleys, keeping the initial promise of an Italian competition. It's the race of the unique stages, of the exceptions, of the very long Lucca-Rome, 430 kilometers, of those places that were part of it only one, such as Mentana, Marsala, Gaeta, Castellana Grotte. So it makes sense that it would eventually return to Campo Imperatore and Bondone with their incredible history, and that it would also reach far from the more well-known mountains, the ones that everyone knows and remembers. The Giro is Bondone. It is Passo Valcava, that tongue of asphalt that climbs Lombard mountains between valleys that remain untouched despite being so close to cities and towns, just over 70 kilometers from Milan and much less from Bergamo. Often passed through by bike enthusiasts in the area who stop to take pictures next to the sign that reminds them that they're at an altitude of 1,340 meters, overlooking a good part of Lombardy. This is the promise that the Giro has always kept, its very strength. It can make you dream with its exploits, that's true, but it can also bring the exceptions closest to the rest of the country. It can bring the champions to those who follow the competition and perhaps retrace those same roads on their bikes. It represents Italy. All of it. In Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs, is a Giro d'Italia podcast produced by Dog Ear, starring Daniel Tanner, executive producer Marta Donà, and Carlo Lenotti. Written by Valentina Camarini, with the editorial support of Giacomo Botto. Directed by Marco Ferrarini. Producer Irene Oriani. Sound design and original music by Pasquale Lo Savio. Recording Dario Cuomo. Artwork Andrea Lodetti. English adaptation Diego Ferrarini. Special thanks to Silvia Forestieri, Eva Visentin and Simone Pozzi.
Una produzione Do Gear.